If you feel anxiety because we're sitting down, we're going to get too comfortable and talk too long, we've already placed some boundaries around ourselves, so don't worry.
The tech team is prepared to wave a sign at us that says mute when we go too long. No joke. So this week and next week, we are going to continue what we started a couple weeks ago, where Pastor Alexa and I kind of have a conversation, particularly around our call and how it relates to our work here. And because it is Communion Sunday and our theme today is called to gather, we're going to talk a little bit about how the open table relates to our call. And I am leading a small group on Wednesday nights where we're looking at various elements of the church and how they're lived out here at First United Methodist Church. And this last Wednesday, we talked about the open table. And we read every week in that class, we're reading a little excerpt from Rachel Held Evans, totally lost her name for a minute, Rachel Held Evans' book called Searching for Sunday. And then using that as a starting point for conversation. And in that book, one of her chapters is called Open Table. So if you were there on Wednesday night, I apologize. We're going to go over some of the same things this morning. But it was such a fun conversation on Wednesday. I wanted to have it with the larger congregation. So this is from her chapter, Open Table. And we're just going to read a very short excerpt of it. So I'm going to start, and then Alexa's going to finish the reading, and then we're going to have a conversation. So when this is, sometimes this essay will use the word I, that's Rachel Held Evans, not me or Alexa, but she's also telling a story of another author named Sarah Miles. When Sarah Miles was 46, she wandered into an unfamiliar church, ate a piece of bread, and took a sip of wine. Until that moment, she'd had no interest in religion. Traveled, liberal, and lesbian, she was raised in a secular home and remained deeply skeptical of what she'd seen of the church, particularly in its more fundamentalist iterations. She'd never been baptized, never read much of the Bible, and never prayed the Lord's Prayer. But at St. Gregory's of Nyssa Episcopal Church in San Francisco, someone invited Sarah to the table. And then something outrageous and terrifying happened, she says. Jesus happened to me. Sarah felt dizzy, overwhelmed, charged with life, filled. Suddenly, she believed. I couldn't reconcile the experience with anything I knew or had been told, Sarah writes in her memoir, Take This Bread. But neither could I go away. For some inexplicable reason, I wanted that bread again. I wanted it all the next day after my first communion, and the next week, and the next. It was a sensation as urgent as physical hunger, pulling me back to the table. Sarah partnered with St. Gregory's to create a massive food pantry where the poor, elderly, sick, homeless, and marginalized from the community are served each week from the very table where Sarah took her first communion. No strings attached, no questions asked. The food pantry recalls a conversation Jesus once had with a group of religious leaders at the home of a prominent Pharisee. When you give a banquet, Jesus said to his host, invite the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed.
This is what God's kingdom is like. A bunch of outcasts and oddballs, gathered at a table.
That was a typo on my part.
Oddballs gathered at a table, not because they are rich or worthy or good, but because they are hungry, because they said yes. And there is always room for more. Holy Communion knocked me upside down and forced me to deal with the impossible reality of God, Sarah writes. Then, as conversion continued, relentlessly challenging my assumptions about religion and politics and meaning, God forced me to deal with all kinds of other people. I wound up not in what church people like to call a community of believers, which tends to be code for a like-minded club, but in something huger and wilder than I had ever expected, the suffering, fractious, and unboundaried body of Christ. Not surprisingly, Sarah advocates for what is called an open table, the practice of inviting all who are physically or spiritually hungry to participate in communion, regardless of religious background or status. I'm with Sarah on this one. I don't know exactly how Jesus is present in the bread and wine, but I believe Jesus is present. So it seems counterintuitive to tell people they have to wait and meet him someplace else before they meet him at the table. If people are hungry, let them come eat. If they are thirsty, let them come and drink.
So in the United Methodist Church, we practice an open table with that same theological grounding. If you are hungry, if you are thirsty, come and receive. And Pastor Alexa and I thought today we would talk a little bit about how the open table is a part of our call and how it relates to our call to help people gather. So, Pastor Alexa, you want to reflect on that a little bit?
Sure. So I think one of the things that communion invites us to do, and particularly me, is into radical hospitality. This is a very articulated value of this congregation. It's something we've heard over and over again, that this is a church that values radical hospitality. I really resonate with the part of Sarah Miles' story that acknowledges this strange assumption that people will meet Jesus somewhere else before meeting Jesus' followers, before coming to the communion table, that's sort of an expectation we have. And then they end up in church, right? You meet Jesus, and then you end up in church. I, of course, think that Jesus can be found in the face of every neighbor, but to not expect people to be introduced to Jesus at church or in communion, in the breaking of the bread with one another, it seems such a strange assumption that at least some parts of the church have. So my sense of call is about removing any barriers there might be to God and to the communion table. I don't think it makes sense as an organization or according to our values or based on the gospel to erect any barriers between the table and the people, between the people and God. I have this poem that hangs in my bedroom, which sort of encapsulates this sense of call. The poet is Lori Hatteen. You can follow her on Instagram, and she sort of illustrates all of her words very beautifully. Prisoners pen scriptures, whores are heroes, and every face resembles holiness. The feet of peasants are washed by the king, and law bows down to love. Outsiders are insiders, and the door is not open, but torn clean from its hinges. This is the house that God built. So I'd say that this radical hospitality of not just leaving the door unlocked maybe, not even leaving it open or ajar, but tearing the door clean from its hinges to make sure that there is no barrier between the people and God's table is sort of the radical hospitality I imagine and feel called into. This radical hospitality as a value invites us not only into just being good hosts, hosting other people well, it's a radical hospitality. It invites us to then also be hosted by people we wouldn't necessarily consider being hosted by. It invites us, sophisticated folks, to be hosted and welcomed and at the mercy of people that we are suspicious of, people that we have questions about, people we don't understand, and just eating with them anyway. People we don't understand, not demanding that all of our curiosities and questions are answered before we do. Eating with them, not expecting our hosts to meet certain thresholds of acceptability. It's knowing that they don't, and likely we don't either, and choosing to delight in breaking bread together anyway. The beginnings of Methodism in the United States included the circuit riders, the preachers who would ride around on horseback to their circuit of towns. Does anyone in this room know what their first stop was in each town? I hear some whispers. The pub. The circuit riders stopping at the pub and pulling mostly men out of the pubs and sending them home to their families, to their wives and their children, expecting that those Methodist men spend their money on feeding their families rather than in the pubs, expecting that they spend their time on building relationships with their families and their communities. Doing that raised up a generation of formerly impoverished people into middle-class people with stable family structures and strong community connections and less addiction. So then all the Methodists are middle class now, and they draw in more middle class people, and we forget where we came from and to whom we are called. What does it look like to develop significant and influential relationships with people who are addicted, people who are neglecting their family responsibilities, people who are traumatized, have low self-worth, people who are economically desperate, people who are suicidal, and trust that mutual transformation is possible? That mutual transformation is possible. Mm-hmm. Us good, sophisticated folks are not called to just make other people more sophisticated and easier to swallow. We are called to be changed, transformed by our relationships with other people into greater love, understanding, and goodwill for our neighbors. What the Open Table invites me into is the idea that communion has a completely different logic than the rest of the world. It lives into a gospel that turns the entire world upside down, where the power in transformation lies in the breaking of bread. Where the power in transformation lies in the breaking of the bread is with people who do not hold power in the rest of the world, who do not hold the power of empire. The power of transformation of our world lies in the hands of people who are kept from power in this world as it is. In communion, our eyes are opened and we begin to see the world as it could be. As Sarah Miles says, a bunch of outcasts and oddballs gathered at a table, not because they are rich or worthy or good, but because they are hungry, because they said yes, and there is always room for more.
It's beautiful.
Thank you.
You're making me cry.
How about you, Heather?
So my story of coming to church is a little bit like Sarah Miles. I went to church when I was a child with friends of our family. And then when I got to be a teenager, probably middle school, I decided that the youth group at the church I was going to was kind of dumb. And I was too cool for church, and I didn't need it anymore anyway. And then I spent much of my early young adulthood not in church at all, until one day, for reasons that I'll share in a different sermon, I walked into the door of the Shelton United Methodist Church, and I was searching for God. I knew I was there to search for God, and I didn't really know how to search for God except to show up at church, which really relates to the fact that the church I went to as a child used to serve great donuts. It was not a church that practiced an open table, so I did not have communion at that church, but I had donuts, and I'm pretty sure that the way they served those donuts to anyone who walked in the door was a practice of communion and open table in some way. They were so hospitable to me that when it came time for me to start looking for God, I started at a church. And I walked into this United Methodist Church on a Sunday morning. I didn't know it was Communion Sunday. I didn't know that was such a thing. But I walked in, and when it came time for communion, the pastor said, this table is open to anyone who wants to come forward and receive these gifts of grace. You don't have to be baptized. I wasn't. And you don't have to be a member of the church. I wasn't. All you need is a desire to receive these gifts of God. And I felt like I had come home. Mm-hmm. And if you think about what a home is like, if you think about those times when you feel a sense of home, one of the elements that's often there is meals around a table with people you love and care about. When my boys come home from college now, one of the things we love to do is have them sit at the dinner table with us, because that's where we get to talk to them and hear about their life and tell them what's going on with us and just reflect a general sense of family and love. And so when that table was open at that Shelton United Methodist Church, a long time ago, 30 years ago now? No, not quite, 23 years ago, it felt like this family that I had not yet really met was inviting me to be a part of them and saying, you're one of us. Come and eat with us. And it felt like on behalf of God, those people were also saying, you're welcome and invited. And it was life-changing. It was transformational. So one of the ways as United Methodists that we articulate our understanding of the open table is because John Wesley said, communion can be a converting sacrament. Those are kind of big church words. What did he mean? He meant that not only is the table open for people who already believe, it is a place where some people might start believing. A converting sacrament. In the taking of the bread and the cup, we might come like Sarah and like me to believe that Jesus loves us. And we might begin our journey of walking in the way of Christ, a converting sacrament. And so the table is not a place where we come after we've already gotten ourselves all squared away and right with God and all of those things. It's a place where those things can happen, and it can transform and change us. So when I came to church, even though I'd had that wonderful experience at a church as a child where they served great donuts and they never asked me, like, where are your parents? How come they're not here? Or you can't do this because you haven't been a part of this church forever. They were so hospitable and welcoming. I was still terrified to walk into a church. I was pretty sure that I was going to give myself away as an oddball or what else the other
Outcast.
An outcast. I was pretty sure that everyone would look at me and know that I hadn't been raised in the church, that I didn't really belong. I was worried about what I wore. I was worried about where I sat. One Sunday, I used to go with my friend. We went together every Sunday. Thank goodness, because I would not have had the courage to walk in by myself. But she was sick, and I decided to go to church anyway, which was huge. I was so scared. And I was going to sit in the back of the church because I kind of wanted to disappear. I didn't want anyone to see me. So I sat in the very back pew. And then about 20 minutes in the service, I realized there was this little tiny plaque that said choir seating. And I was mortified. I was sure I had sat where the choir was supposed to sit, and I had just not only sat in the wrong pews, but revealed myself to be as ignorant as I was about the customs of church. Turned out the choir had not sat in those pews for decades, right? Because we do that at church, right? Where we don't take down things that are no longer relevant because we assume everyone knows the choir doesn't sit here anymore. But I didn't know. And so I sat through that service just so embarrassed that I had made this mistake. This was after I'd already received communion, because that was on my first Sunday that I received communion. But I tell you this because it represents how much I longed to be a part of church, that I would go even though I was terrified, and how scary it was for me. And so to encounter this table where they said, you, who don't know where to sit, who aren't sure how to dress, maybe don't know church words, or how they used to say, we are going to have coffee in the narthex. And I was like, what is that? Where's the narthex? Where are we having coffee? I learned, because the coffee was always right outside the sanctuary, that was the narthex. But when they said that, and a Pharisee, they used that word once in worship when I was pretty new. I did not know what a Pharisee was. Anyway, to have been received at that table was so meaningful and so powerful and so transformative that it became a part of my call to welcome anyone to that table. People who are terrified of church, people who have been harmed by church, people who are oddballs and outcasts. Like Jesus, to welcome people who might be prostitutes, tax collectors, whatever that might look like in our current world, to welcome the houseless, to welcome the good religious people, and to welcome the people who aren't sure that good has ever been used in association with describing them. While I was at Shelton, we had a woman named Michelle who started coming to church. And Michelle, I'm getting the mute sign. Okay, I'm going to finish my Michelle story and then we'll be done. So Michelle came to church, and she was off again, on again, houseless. Most of the time she slept in her car. She did have an aunt in the community, and she could go to her aunt's house, but Michelle didn't often shower, and Michelle didn't often brush her teeth. And so Michelle carried a certain smell with her. And Michelle also loved to hug me. And sometimes when Michelle would hug me at church, I literally had to hold my breath. And there were times where I just didn't want to hug Michelle. Now, I want to say, of course, we are a church that practices boundaries. If you don't want to hug someone, you can say no hugs. But in this case, it wasn't that I didn't want to have a hug. It was more that sometimes Michelle's smell was a little hard to take. And I would think about Jesus, and I would think, what would Jesus do? That great youth group phase. And I knew that Jesus would have welcomed Michelle with open arms. And so I would do that as well. And of course, Michelle would come to the communion table, and we would eat at the table together. And I would be reminded at that table that Michelle and I were equal in Jesus' eyes, that I had nothing over Michelle. In fact, Michelle had things to teach me about what it meant to love unconditionally. And one Valentine's Day, again, this is an element that is not at the communion table, and yet it was communion. Michelle brought me a Valentine's cake. She'd gone to her aunt's house, and she made a cake. And the way the walkway at the Shelton Church was, sitting in my office, I could see Michelle walking up with this cake. It was the hottest pink frosting I have ever seen. It was almost neon pink. And it was in the shape of a heart, and she's carrying this cake. And I know it's for me because Michelle and I were friends at this point. And I'm thinking to myself, I don't know if I can eat a cake made by Michelle. Because she doesn't shower often and she doesn't wash often. Sometimes she smells. And yet, as I watched her walk up, I thought, that cake is nothing but love. That cake is Michelle's love for me and my love for her, and somehow in this mix, God's love for both of us that has brought us together. And when she brings me that cake, even though we're going to eat it in my office, it will be an act of communion, and it will be an act of open table, because we will be there together, and somehow God is binding us together into the body of Christ. And so Michelle brought that cake, and I went and I got plates, and we ate that cake together, and it was the breaking of the bread. And in that moment, I knew that Michelle was my spiritual teacher, not the other way around. And that's the power to me of the open table, is that when we come, we all come together, and none of us are better than anyone else. And because we gather as oddballs and outcasts, all of us, somehow, in this act of communion, we are all made holy. Okay. Only a few minutes past sound booth. Thank you for that warning.
In response to this word spoken, let us enter into a sanctuary of prayer.
Our song team will come forward.